Hello, everybody. My name is Graham Brookie. I'm the director and managing editor of the Atlantic Council's DFR Lab. It is my pleasure to welcome you, albeit virtually, to a conversation, Initial Reactions, Disinformation in 2020 Elections. This event is very much the product of a equal partnership called the Election Integrity Partnership, a coalition of really premier research teams that have focused on supporting real-time monitoring and information exchange, information sharing between not only the research community, the organizations that make up this partnership, but also election officials, government agencies, other civil society actors, and social media platforms. The partnership is absolutely made up of not only the DFR Lab, but also the Stanford Internet Observatory, Graphica, the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public, and it was created to detect and mitigate the impact of election disinformation, misinformation, disinformation about when, where, and how to vote, the results of the election, and everything that kind of goes into this very narrowly tailored scope of what makes elections critical infrastructure here in the United States. So this partnership has conducted nearly almost 24/7 monitoring of the information space, especially last week. And so the faces that you'll see today, hopefully we've all caught up on a little bit of sleep. We don't have the rings that we had under our eyes last week. And working together, this partnership has really committed itself to nonpartisan analysis and building resilience against disinformation and other online harms in the context of elections. And as we know, disinformation, of course, is a central vulnerability both in the lead up, during, and now after US elections. I'm joined today by the partners, Camille Francois of Graphica, Alex Stamos of the Stanford Internet Observatory, Kate Starbird at the Center for an Informed Public at University of Washington, and of course, my colleague Emerson Brookings here at the Atlantic Council. We will have a very brief discussion about how this partnership has worked, the scale and scope of this partnership, what it's been committed to, the nonpartisan analysis that it's been committed to. I would also just hedge this entire conversation by saying this is very much initial reactions based on the research that we've done, based on the scope of our work. And we'll be putting out a comprehensive report later on in the coming months about all of the kind of deep dive into the data that we've seen, among other things. And so this is very much an initial reactions conversation, what we're continuing to see in the information environment, and we'll have further analysis going forward. We're going to have a very brief conversation among ourselves, and then we'll head over to the Q&A. If you have any questions, please drop them into the chat, as well as on social media, following along with the conversation. So with that, thank you very much for joining, and over to you, Emerson.
Hey, Graham, thanks very much. Still have a few rings under the eyes, but a little bit less than last week. So we're joined by nearly 200 people on the line. So it's my intention to have a very brief conversation and then try to get to as much audience Q&A as possible. So go ahead and be thinking about those questions and inputting them now. But I want to try to take a step back now, because our organizations have been at the Election Integrity Partnership together for about 3 months now. As Graham said, we've been conducting 24/7 monitoring, and we've assessed, I think at this point, 1,000 different narratives. But I want to reflect on how this organization came together, and there's no better person to start with than Alex Stamos. So Alex, I'm curious if you could just tell us a bit about the origin of this idea and how you brought our organizations together.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Emerson. Thank you guys for hosting us today. And welcome to everybody who's calling in for the first time. So a brief history here of how this came together. The original kind of goal here is, our group at Stanford had been doing work for a little while with CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, which is the new agency under DHS that was created a couple of years ago to take over and consolidate the cybersecurity responsibility inside of DHS and inside of the US government. They are the primary agency responsible for working with the local and state election officials who actually run our elections. As I'm sure most of the attendees on here know, the United States is somewhat unique in that something like 8,000 different authorities are responsible for running their own local elections. There is no unified security standards across all of them. And so CISA has had their hands full for the last several years of working with all of these different kinds of officials and trying to figure out how they could support them best against what was a set of known adversaries who are very, very skilled. CISA did an excellent job on that on the cybersecurity side. We as a country owe a lot to the people there. Chris Krebs, the director, Matt Masterson, Brian Scully. There's a long list, Jeanette Manfra, a long list of people who've worked very hard on the pure cyber side. And while today we're talking about some disinformation problems, things could have been way, way worse if they had not done such a good job on the security of the election infrastructure itself. I was lucky enough to put 4 interns at CISA starting in the early summer. And what those interns discovered as they were working in election security was that while CISA had the authorizations and the capabilities to respond to actual cyber attacks, their capabilities on the disinformation side were very limited, both by kind of the legal structures in place, but also the kinds of people that they had under their roof. And so kind of in jointly with them, we had a discussion about what if we had a capability that existed outside of the government that took no government money that could coordinate between local and state election officials, the different platforms, a variety of different civil society groups, and then could do our own research and then match up what we find against the policies of the companies. And so that was kind of the genesis of that there was this vacuum here, this need here. And in putting that together, what we wanted was we wanted to have the absolute best people in the world at this, which are the other 3 institutions that are reflected here. All of these institutions have done lots and lots of work. And I think kind of one of the ways I think about this is all 4 of us were going to write big old reports of what happened in the election, but that's going to come out like in February or March. And this was an opportunity for us to work together to actually do that work in real time and perhaps have some impact. We're still writing the report, especially Kate and I have to publish or perish. So we got to get our name on something. But I am very proud of the fact that we could have impact during that. So we pulled this all together. And as you said, we started operationally in September and then slowly ramped up until during election week, we were working 20 hours a week. Overall, the EIP is about 120 people contributing, about 35 people in the first tier of analysts, about 50 people in that second tier who are the second tier of analysts who could be pulled in to look more deeply into narratives of pieces of disinformation, and then a bunch of really important support staff, operational people and the like. Here we are. It's still going. Here we are on day hour 147 or so of election day. But yeah, that's kind of the history of how we got here.
Mm-hmm. And then, as you just said, each of our institutions kind of sits in a different place, but we're all part of this emerging counter-disinformation field. So I want to bring in our other representatives now to kind of talk about what led them to this collaboration and, their thoughts on it and how it might differ from previous partnerships in this space. And perhaps the applicability of this model going forward. And first to you, Kate.
Yeah, so I'm Kate Starbird. I'm an associate professor at the University of Washington, and I'm actually a new co-founder of Center for an Informed Public there. And that becomes important for how we end up doing this collaboration. So just a little bit of background on our work. We look at online rumors, misinformation, disinformation in the context of crisis events, and then now more broadly around some other questions where disinformation is persistent in some kinds of discourse. The interesting thing about our work is we work at the academic timescale normally, which is, you identify something, you start studying it, you do some analyses, your team, and 6 to 8 months later, you've got a paper draft and you're publishing on this kind of very slow scale. And so what's been really interesting for us when we received this call from Alex, can you participate? Absolutely. And then our question was, how do we very quickly change the scale at which we work, the speed at which we work to be able to plug into a partnership like this? And and also in academia, you give us a call in August, we've already got all of our students and everything set up for the next quarter. How do we all of a sudden hire, ramp on different kind of participants and get people going? So with the help of some great early funding, we were able to really quickly hire, bring some people in, expand our capacity, and really focused our participation on what they call tier 2 analysis, but analysis that went beyond, maybe just one ticket or one incident to kind of look at kind of patterns across different incidents, and also look at how things were spreading, using some of the skills that we developed as researchers and visualization, network graphs, and some other kinds of visualizations that we like to use, and bring that as a resource to this team and plug in. So it's been a fascinating few weeks. I know that the students and other researchers that were participating on our side have been they've been amazing. Some of them I've never met in person. We just brought them in, and we all feel like we're a big family now, and we're ready to have reunions for the rest of our life, because it was very, very intense work. I know others have felt that way too, but very intense work, exciting, but kind of nerve-wracking, because it's so important to get things right. And so we felt a lot of pressure and stress as we're doing this work, even as we began to feel like, oh my goodness, we're having some impact, which in academia, impact happens again at the scale of the publications, which is very, very slowly. And to be having this kind of impact in the moment was a really interesting experience. And so we're just really fortunate to have been invited and to have worked with these great other sort of partner institutions here. I know we all had previous relationships, but certainly this has solidified them, and it's been really exciting. And just, we were really happy that we could bring something to the partnership that hopefully was a value add from our side. And it's been a great experience. And certainly we want to study this from the academic perspective to think about how collaborations like this could work in the future. So we're really interested in this collaboration itself as an objective research study going forward.
Mm-hmm. And Camille?
I know we have a lot of ground to cover, so I'll keep it short. I think from our perspective, a lot of the same sort of feelings, were experienced when Alex called and said, hey, let's do this together. First, it's a bunch of institutions whom we adore and whose work we respect. We're very enthused about the idea of working together. And the other thing is, our team is strong on violent extremism and foreign interference. We also wanted to make sure that we could collectively pool resources to not duplicate work unnecessarily, and to make sure that we would together arrive at a standard of rigor that we knew we were going to have to maintain at an incredible pace. It's not exactly an instant peer review, because there is no such thing, but working together with all the institutions also allowed us to say, okay, this is what we have and this is our conclusion. All of this matters, and we want to make sure we get it right. As Kate said, let's make sure that we can collectively poke at it and do this fast collective verification, because that really mattered a lot on our end.
And over to you, Graham.
Yeah, I just think that at the DFR lab, we have kind of the opposite problem of academia, where we're moving extremely fast all the time. And so, our plans are created for tomorrow, in the morning. And we've been kind of drinking from this fire hose of disinformation for a long, long time. And so this was a really, really good opportunity to step back and apply that, rapid pace analysis into a more structured setup with friends and partners. I mean, I think that the things that have really, really worked well, and one important point is that all of these partners have set aside each individual organization's incentives in this period to do something collective and bigger than the sum of our parts. And that's really, really impressive. I think that what has made this work on a structural basis is the very narrow scope of what we are, or the limited scope of what we are looking at. We're not trying to look at all of the disinformation in the entire universe that mentions elections once. We're looking at a very specific type of disinformation, misinformation, online falsehood about the results or the process of the election. That's one thing that sets us apart. So not trying to be all things to all people. And then making sure that we have this kind of ability, as Camille said, to kind of divvy things up, which takes some of the pressure off of us individually. I mean, I think that if we were doing all of the analysis as individual organizations, then every time we had a conversation like this, I would be a little bit more freaked out because I would have to be extremely comprehensive in all of the things that DFR Lab was saying, as opposed to being like, okay, well, I know that, Camille has been looking at foreign interference for the last 24 hours, and Kate has been looking at like overarching conspiracy theories that are consolidated, or like individual cases of disinformation that are consolidating into conspiracy theories. I know that Alex and Renee and others at Stanford have been looking at a totally different piece. And so like as a team, we got this, we got each other's backs. And that's been something that is extremely not only gratifying, but effective.
And I want to add, because we have a number of people on the phone, on the call from outside the US, and like members of our scholarship program and Digital Sherlocks, who are essentially trying to emulate and build counter disinformation skills in other countries. And what blew me away, managing shifts here and working with this huge team, was just a reminder of like the diversity of backgrounds you can have, but still get good at this stuff really fast. Like some of our starter frontline analysts were, 18 to 19-year-olds out of Stanford, who, as I understand, had taken just a training or two before beginning their work with us. But by the end of this 2 or 3 months, like some of them have emerged as rock stars, like absolutely reliable, novel, creative. So it just shows how quickly you can get good at this stuff, and just the diversity of perspectives, which helps in this counter disinformation field. So moving on, it's too early to tell the full saga of the 2020 election yet. And we're going to have that comprehensive report in a few months. But I'm curious from this group, just a few top line assessments of narratives you saw and how those narratives evolved over the last few months and what we might be seeing today. And I want to start now with Camille.
Thanks, Emerson. I was also just going to highlight from a mechanisms perspective. When we say we all did this work together, we really mean that for each shift, there was a team assembled from researchers and analysts from all the various institutions. So it wasn't the case that there was a Graphica shift, a DFR shift, and Stanford shift. It really was everybody together making makeshift teams drawn from researchers across all institutions, which I think was a really, really fantastic part of this project. To your question, Emerson, the thing that we are seeing through all these tickets that we have processed over the election period is, I think, can be recapped, or at least sort of somewhat organized in an evolution of the type of disinformation that we observed. The first sort of phase of it, if you want, is a phase where the tickets and things that were reported to us were really isolated incidents. And so a lot of people reporting from the polls and saying this happened and that happened, and look at the ballots that I received. This incidence here, I think, really put the onus on us and on the partnership to do a very quick and rapid verification exercise. I think we've been very grateful for the participation of election officials in this work. They were able to be very responsive and to be able to say, like, yes, this did happen at this polling station. That is actually a real video, or no, this poll worker whistleblower actually never was a registered poll worker. And so going through all these incidents, I think, was our first phase. The second phase of it, I think we saw these incidents sort of organize themselves into clear narratives. Some of those narratives had been seeded before, but having those incidents sort of like now become narrative also gave a lot of the things that we had already fact-checked sort of a new life. And so a good example of a narrative here would be the Sharpiegate campaign. And then the third, stage of it is when these narratives become movements of their own, right? Where multiple narratives sort of come together in a mobilization process. And so the Stop the Steal protests and movements, for instance, were part of this. At that stage, I think some of our focus and concern was also to make sure that no organized threat of violence were being communicated as part of this mobilization. Our concerns were also for some of the targeted harassment campaigns against people who were, in these incidents. And so this is sort of like a very, very rough sketch of everything we've seen and sort of the evolution that, again, acknowledging that the boundaries between phases are not as perfect as we would want in a graph.
And over to you, Kate.
Yeah, just to build off of that a little bit, I think that's a great way to think about some of all of the work, sort of the pathway through it. We can look over to some of the research that's been done in the past for sort of similar cases and different kinds of events where initially you might see rumors and rumors and they might be unrelated and they might be individual and whatever, and they'll usually spike really fast, get a lot of attention, and then they'll fade away. But what will happen, and what sometimes happens, is some rumors kind of stick, and instead of kind of spiking and going away, they begin to kind of build into conspiracy theory that becomes a longer term orientation around a particular narrative or set of narratives. And definitely what we've seen here is this. If we go all the way back to August, we had tickets starting in August when we first got going, and there was this meta narrative all along that there was going to be widespread voter fraud, a false meta narrative that was already kind of preemptively put in this space that there would be systematic voter fraud. And over time, we saw these different incidents get picked up and try to fit into that narrative. And after the election, on election day and afterwards, that became this massive exercise. If you watch sort of the online behavior and the broader information ecosystem of sort of these little individual incidents try to get fit into these narratives. And some of them fade away, they get effectively debunked, but others sort of have this staying power. And that staying power became, and it was organized around, as Camille said, and became sort of these movements. But what I predict we'll continue to see is kind of a consolidation around a couple of narratives that have more staying power, that fit into this large meta narrative and false meta narrative of voter fraud, and that continue and that persist. If we look at some of the things we've studied in the past, these will probably persist for years or even decades, unfortunately, because people are very motivated to both participate in them and believe them. And so that's what I think we're going to see going forward.
Yeah. We're almost describing kind of a cycle of rebirth with some of these narratives. Over to you, Alex.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a great summary. I'll add 2 quick points. One, an interesting thing was almost all this is domestic, right? So, to preempt the question that we've gotten every single day since election day, there has been some foreign action. There's obviously a lot of overt foreign activity. Overt meaning the declared media outlets and Twitter accounts and the like of foreign governments. There has been a little bit covert. We're going to talk about it, but nothing that is that interesting. It is all domestic. And the second point on the domestic, a huge part of the problem is well-known influencers. And I think that was a theme that we saw during the entire week, is that you have a relatively small number of people with very large followings who have the ability to go and find a narrative somewhere, pick it out of obscurity, and then to some kind of little idea, one tweet, one photo, one video, and then to harden it into these narratives. And that, I think, will be a big part of our analysis, will be in how that kind of process happened. And I think that is going to be the absolute biggest challenge for the platforms going forward. It is very easy to come up with rules about Russian trolls in St. Petersburg. It's one thing to come up with rules that you enforce against people with 100 or 200 followers. When you talk about people who have millions of folks who have decided they're going to make the affirmative step of following this person's account, they're going to religiously reload their YouTube page for the newest video, they're going to watch all their Facebook lives, then how do you handle those people is a humongous problem. And makes the platforms less of kind of like a content moderation, and it's almost more of the editorial process you would see at like a cable network, right? And it's the metaphor, I think, has shifted for me in some ways of the ways the companies have to act, because you're not talking about kind of grassroots activity so much anymore. You're talking about top-down activity that is facilitated by the ability for these folks to create these audiences that are a significant fraction of the audience of a primetime cable news show. Which is that's the other thing that's interesting. I think our numbers will come out is, TV is still on election day incredibly influential, but as we get further away from the election, TV becomes less influential and social media becomes more. And I think we're starting to see that shift, that a lot of this stuff has moved online.
Yeah. And Graham?
I absolutely nothing to add, save for the fact that I think that some of the individual cases of disinformation that we've seen will kind of consolidate into long-term conspiracy theories that we'll be seeing for a long, long, long time, much like other instances of disinformation in previous iterations or elections or whatever have become like old friends that revisit us every once in a while. One question that we need to answer in the chat, which is just a point of order. Somebody asked what a ticket is. It wouldn't be a systemic approach if we hadn't created some bureaucracy. So a ticket, it was an individual case that the partnership monitored.
And with that, we are lucky to have a ton of questions already. So I'm going to move right to them. And the first is just, what surprised you the most? What was the thing you did not expect? An interesting tactic, narrative, or something else? And I like this question in particular because cumulatively on this line, I think we have about 30 years of experience studying a phenomenon that's really quite new. But there also was quite a bit that was surprising this cycle. And throughout this Q&A, folks, please feel free to step in. When there's a brief pause, I'll move on to the next question. But the question here is, what surprised you the most over the course of the EIP work?
I'll jump in. I think that the extent to which we saw some new actors, I mean, noting that we are still looking at stuff across the information environment, our analysis will be comprehensive in the near future once we've piled through all of the tickets and data and all of that stuff. So like, bear with us there. But like the things that are surprising just from a minute to minute basis is the extent to which we've seen a ton of, for lack of a better word, old actors that we've seen before domestically, but some new actors kind of in the space that have good amounts of traction, but we haven't typically associated with like, oh, that's part of an ecosystem that makes sense. That's extremely preliminary. That's like totally off the cuff. That said, it's been somewhat surprising to see new actors come into the space and not the like age-old memes of foreign interference at scale, et cetera. So that's one initial takeaway.
Yeah, I was just saying, I was interested how quickly some of the disinformation followed what was interesting in the electoral college race. So Sharpiegate, which is one of our big themes that came out of this, and is one of the narratives that has hardened, started with somebody in Chicago with a post that I think was actually legit of just, hey, was I supposed to use a Sharpie? This is weird. It bleeds through. Illinois, not at all a swing state, but it gets picked up. And then the moment Arizona became interesting on the maps on TV, minutes later, all of a sudden, Sharpiegate becomes an issue in Arizona. And so the fact that the disinformation was not pretty clearly, there are people who are trying to spread this in the places where they knew there was going to be friction and possible legal challenges. And so looking at that timeline and how quickly it happened, I think that was surprising to me.
I think adding to that, sorry, go ahead, Kate.
No, you go ahead, Camille. I'll go last.
Okay. I was going to say something else that we talked a lot, amongst the partners is the importance of alternative platforms too throughout this election cycle. And, initially, Carly in the Stanford team started this fantastic analysis of each platform's policies having to do with electoral information. And it became almost a joke for us to say, oh, well, here's one more platform that we should have considered as part of this initial analysis, right? When there was a big Twitch live stream, it also became like, okay, how many other platforms are actually part of the conversation on the election integrity that we're tracking and monitoring. So that I think surprised us from a policy perspective, but it also surprised us very clearly in all these incidents that we were monitoring. Very quickly, we saw an entire sort of, alternate cast of platforms that had very different moderation standards and rules than the other platforms we were working with, and that prolonged the life of some of these incidents and narratives. So I think the role of alternative platforms was an interesting surprise on many different perspectives here.
And I'm probably going to build right into that on this one, but one of the things that was surprising, they get beat up all the time, the platforms do, and I'm sure we'll go back and say they did this that wrong or that wrong, but a lot of the big platforms were taking actions at a rate and with policies that they had improved over the period of time that we started studying them. And in a lot of ways, I thought they did a pretty good job compared to things that in the past, the platforms were able to take action. They were responsive. They were putting on labels. They were taking things out of circulation that were problematic in different ways. And I thought that was a pleasant surprise. Certainly, we were integrated in that to some level. So maybe my perspective there is shaped by some of that. But I do think what they tried to do was commendable, which is why people were moving to other platforms. And so that's definitely part of it. And the other thing that surprised me, and I'm not sure how this is going to land, but we started kind of reacting to tickets in August, September, and we had tickets or whatever. And we began to be like, oh, this is how it's going to play out. And we could see it based on some, the research and other people talking about what the timelines and the votes were going to come in. And up until this day, what I'm surprised by is how absolutely predictable this stuff was, and still is. And we even wrote a report. We published it a week before, but we've been working on it for 3 weeks before about like how it was going to play out, how the narratives would come up, how they would collect, incidents from the day of and tie them into these voter fraud narratives. And it's exactly how it played out. I mean, we got a few things wrong, and missed a couple other things. But the predictability of it, after being in this space so long, it all seemed so novel and weird in 2016. And right now it just seems so mundane. And I don't know how to otherwise say that, but it does. It just seems really predictable. And I think that's something that maybe means that the research community is getting our heads around what this is that we're facing.
Mm-hmm. So we have so many questions. I'm going to start trying to thematically group them a bit. And on this topic of narratives, Flora asks, are there any particular features that make some rumors or narratives stickier than others that we've identified? And then in kind of a related vein, someone asks if any narratives we encountered we found particularly dangerous. And along that front, is it the case that these smaller platforms like Parler, these alternative social media sites, post more dangerous narratives than the mainstream platforms? So it's a question of danger and then a question of stickiness in the narratives we've encountered.
Just to shortly answer here, I think we were afraid initially, kind of worried about narratives that look like they might motivate violence in the real world. And that's something that we've been pleasantly surprised hasn't turned out in the same way that we were worried about. And certainly when we were looking at those narratives, we were looking to platforms that were a little bit long tail away from the primary platforms. And that's something that seemed, I think it's all dangerous depending on how you look at it, but that seems like acutely problematic and is something that we actually didn't end up, especially on election day, didn't end up seeing a lot of that as we were worried about, which was another kind of pleasant surprise that happened along the way.
Just one thing that's made things sticky, and I think we've seen a lot of this in the last couple of days, is when people claim some kind of technical background and then come up with a bunch of gobbledygook that makes it sound legitimate, right? And so we saw this around Bedford's Law, this really complex kind of mathematical idea around what real numbers look like versus fake numbers in a real life process. Kate's team wrote an incredible explainer in which they actually built a computer simulation and then ran a simulation to demonstrate why Bedford's Law is not totally applicable in the situation we're talking about. And then we're seeing now of people saying, I'm a cybersecurity expert, and I believe it's possible that the CIA actually has a supercomputer that can change the results of an election, right? And so I think that also kind of the appeal to authority funny enough, from people who often reject authority, has been somewhat effective in a couple of these cases. And in those cases, I think that's why we have to have like good technical. On that latter one, Director Krebs of CISA has been really good about personally going out and saying, look, this is completely not true. And so in any of these kind of like technical gobbledygook things, I think like we're going to have experts who come out who put their name by this is totally ridiculous. The problem is to normal people, it just sounds like two experts. And this is actually what we've seen a lot around COVID, right? Is that all you need is one MD who, works on orthopedic issues of the foot, saying that, and then they're measured up against a expert viral epidemiologist. And to normal consumers of information, it's difficult to measure which one is which. I am subtweeting a fellow Hoover Institution person there. But if he wants to sue me, that's his choice.
I think I agree with what my colleague said. Narratives that are sticky tend to be narratives that have been preceded. As Kate highlighted, a lot of this we really saw coming. Narratives that are sticky are also narratives that are amplified with people who have large platforms. Every time we run a network graph to understand how a conversation unfolds, that makes it crystal clear. And as Alex said, narratives that are sticky are also narratives that are a bit more complex to debunk, either because they require some form of technical expertise or because they actually get people to think about like, okay, what does that even mean? I haven't understood the claim, therefore I haven't gotten my head yet wrapped around debunking, because the very first claim was harder to understand than initially thought. So a bunch of different factors that create virality in the end.
So we began to receive several questions about foreign interference. And the first from Jeff Selden. Before the election, CISA especially warned about activity from Russia-backed outlets like RT Sputnik and Rupli. What type of reach and what type of impact have they had in the US, whether in English or other languages? And a related question is, in a noisy, extremely noisy, always noisy domestic information environment, but especially noisy around election times, to what extent have we been able to disentangle the effects of foreign interference versus domestic and constitutionally sanctioned political expression?
Okay, who wants to start? Fine. Okay, so let's try to separate two concepts. Foreign interference, I think often we put together the role of state-sponsored media, Russia Today, Sputnik, and we have a small tendency at times to confuse it with covert campaigns, information operation, Russian trolls who are pretending to be Americans, right? And on the latter part, we've received, as Alex stressed, every day during our briefing, new questions around, are they fake accounts, either Iranian or Chinese or Russian, that have been shaping that conversation? And the answer is yes, a handful, and they did so without any form of impact whatsoever. Now, why and how did we avoid the impact of those fake accounts on the conversation is a really important question, because tackling foreign interference isn't a day off issue, right? Tackling a fake narratives that can appear out of the air is a day off issue, but tackling foreign interference takes months of work by many different institutions across research institutions, across the government, across the platforms. And the first, for instance, Russian campaign that talked about the US 2020 election that was detected, I think, was in December 2019. And we have since continued to set and expose and investigate and turn off many different small networks that we're trying to get set up ahead of the election. And so one of the reasons why we haven't seen a large impact of these fake accounts is that most of them had been detected month ahead of the election, thanks to efforts that were focused on this. And the few ones that remain active were usually hiding on alternative platforms and had zero traction whatsoever on this. If you follow what the Department of Justice has published onto these interference campaigns, again, from Russia to Iran, and what all the platforms have published on those information operations that they took down, you really see quite a lot of work to prevent detect before they can have any impact, take down, and transparently report on these foreign interference campaigns. So that's just replacing back in the broader timeline of when efforts on these questions matter.
Completely agree with that. I mean, to the extent that, we're all on the guard up against foreign interference. One key trend that was very interesting to see, not just in the context of like the few weeks before the election, but in the context of years of creating muscle memory around this between government and media and tech, is that some of the actors that had a good amount of impact in a year like 2016, like the Internet Research Agency, the artist formerly known as the IRA, there have been kind of assets that have been making attempts over the last little bit that have been tangentially focused on the United States or on United States political discourse, as well as countries like Turkey and a lot of other places. And the good news is that you haven't heard much about them because platforms like Facebook and law enforcement agencies like the FBI have been really good at detecting them before they have huge audience impact or before they have had huge kind of infiltration operations that have gotten into communities and pushed them in a further direction. And so one of the I think the success stories over the last, not just this election cycle, but over the last few years, has been the amount of information sharing on that topic specifically that has gone into a good amount of early detection. Now, the bad news is that bad actors, and especially foreign actors or actors that have nation state resources, will continue to evolve over time. And so this isn't, let's not put like the final, let's not call this the final chapter on, oh, we're really good at detecting and deterring foreign interference at this point. But I think we've done better than in the past because our guard is up a lot higher, and because of the amount of information sharing between groups like those that are on this call right now, but also government and the tech platforms especially.
Yeah, and just to echo what Graham said, I think the cooperation between government and tech platforms has been very effective in this. These institutions put together have probably written, 60 or 70 papers over the last 12 months talking about the outcome of those takedowns. I think the two challenges here are, one, how do we maintain this, right? So clearly there was a real push for Cyber Command to defend forward. There were dedicated groups at the FBI working on foreign influence, and there was large dedicated teams at the tech companies all working together. I hope that doesn't go away, right? Like, and so we have to figure out how to regularize that and come up with a kind of speech and privacy framework that we're all kind of comfortable with outside of the extreme situation around the election. And then the second is, what do we do for other countries? So all of these institutions, we also write about how disinformation is affecting other countries. Just this week, my colleague Shelby Grossman led our team in writing up a takedown in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not going to have a cyber command. Afghanistan is not going to have the ability to work with Facebook in the same way. And so this was a takedown by Facebook, and so they did the right thing. But like, it makes you wonder, in the situations where you don't have countries being able to defend forward and work on their own interests here, what kind of civil society solutions can we put in place to support people in these countries, also in situations where their government is their adversary? Like, there's a huge benefit here of Cyber Command being somewhat independent of the political goals, or completely independent of the political goals of the current president, and acting in a way that was independent of kind of where things were going. And I think that's wonderful. That we have to make sure that stays true in the United States. We have to figure out how we work in other places where the ruling party is using all of the power of the state to keep themselves in power, instead of to try to reduce foreign influence.
So we have, it's a frequent question, but we have two good questions from Carmen and Alexandra regarding comparisons between 2016 and 2020. And we do get this a bit. Before we keep going, I will also drop in the chat, but if you go to eipartnership.net, you'll read a number of blog posts we've done, including specifically on this subject, of which Professor Starbird was a contributor. But I'm curious on both the foreign interference front and just thinking about the way narratives have spread in this 2020 cycle. How does it compare to our assessment in 2016?
I think the big one we've already mentioned, and maybe to make it sort of concise here, It's 2016. We were concentrated on, coordinated behavior from inauthentic actors that were foreign. Now that might not have been the whole situation. It certainly wasn't, but that became a focus of the post hoc analysis of what had been going on in the information spaces. So 2016, inauthentic coordinated action. 2020, authentic actors, verified accounts, loosely collaborating, not necessarily coordinating behind the scenes, although they may have been in some places, to spread mis and disinformation, and mostly domestic, right? So very kind of different situation there. But yeah, away from sort of coordinated and authentic behavior to more loosely organized, top-down verified accounts, authentic accounts, really driving the disinformation that we've been studying.
Just adding to this, I think we've said this a few times, but it really is night and day between 2016 and 2020 on that topic. If you take foreign interference alone, on 2016, the platform didn't really have a term to talk about this, didn't have rules to enforce against this, didn't have teams responsible for it. It was also a blind spot for the US government. And as Alex highlighted, this is a totally different environment now where we see a lot of focus and a lot of hard work that went into this, yelling us to ask, what is the sustainability of this? What is the scalability of this? But it is definitely a pendulum shift. And it is from night and day, both from the platforms, the government, and the research community, which, as Kate highlighted, now has found the vocabulary and the methods to be able to do this collaborative work together and to do it quickly.
One thing that is in the good news, bad news framework, the good news is that this is now a kitchen table topic. If you say the word disinformation to somebody across the United States, then they'll kind of register to be like, oh yeah, that's a thing that I need to be worried about. Two bad news components of that is that everybody kind of assumes that disinformation is somebody else's problem to deal with, as opposed to something that they might be at least a little bit responsible in their own immediate information environments with friends or family, or the type of news that they're consuming, the type of media that they're consuming. So that's one bad news. And then the other piece of that's been a little bit surprising is the extent to which 2016 has become a little bit of a meme within the counter disinformation community of oh, okay, well, 2016 and various components of what we saw in 2016 have become a meme that I think all of us on the call have had to answer a lot of questions about, even if it's not as big a vulnerability as it was in 2016. The extent to which I think we've all had to answer questions about Russian bots over the last 4 years. If we each had a nickel for every single time we've had to do that, all of our collective centers would likely be endowed, and we would have a partnership in the long term because it would be paid for. So it's kind of interesting as this conversation evolves and as we build more vocabulary, to Camille's point, how much we have to kind of also right-size the conversation about the vulnerabilities that we face because of things that have been, as successful in the past that aren't a thing anymore.
So we have a number of questions now about the sustainability and wider applicability of the sort of model we built with the EIP. And I'll throw out just a couple of questions in this bucket. From Prerna, sounds like we did get industry partners to push the envelope a little bit in the US context. But how can a similar kind of pressure and responsiveness be elicited from platforms when it's not a US election with huge regulatory stakes for these companies? From Naja, there's increasing talk in the European Union of establishing disinformation hubs for monitoring. And there's a curiosity about how the EIP model might be applicable here, or prospects for transatlantic cooperation with importing some of the lessons learned that we've drawn from the EIP experience. And then Fabio asks generally about the sustainability of this sort of project. We stood this thing up for the 2020 election, but is this an experiment we intend to keep going? So the questions, which I think Alex touched on one aspect of this previously, but questions are, pushing the platforms to do better outside the US, transatlantic cooperation and applicability of these lessons, and then how we just keep this thing sustained and moving. So whoever wants to tackle these first.
Yeah, I'll do real quick. So, on effectively pushing the platforms to do stuff. So yes, there's a basic problem that they will always be more responsive in the places that are both economically highly important and that have huge potential regulatory impact. Most notably right now, that would be the United States and Europe. In other places, there's a regulatory impact that actually cuts both ways because, like, say in India, you have the ruling party, on both sides of the disinformation issue. And so it gets very complicated once you leave kind of the US and Europe about how the regulatory issues cut. My suggestion is, if people want to get the platforms to do stuff, is first you got to push for written policies that are specific and that give you predictability, right? And so this is something we started in the summer. In August, is, as Kate talked about, Carly Miller led a team from all four institutions to look at the detailed policies of the big platforms and to measure them against situations that we expected to happen. Now, we're not going to take credit for all the changes they made, but we had to update this thing like 8 or 9 times, right? And so, like, putting these people in a grid to say, you're not handling this, you're not handling this, not handling this, creates a lot of pressure inside of the companies and forces them to kind of grapple with these issues, because you want specific policies that you can hold them accountable for. The second is, when you report stuff to them, report how it's violating those written policies, right? So there's 2 steps here: get good policies, and then say, this is how it's violating it. There's a lot of criticism of the platforms that effectively is like, X company is garbage. Okay, you can say that, you can have an opinion. That doesn't do anything. I'm just going to be frank, right? Like, just saying X company is garbage, not going to do anything. This company is violating this written policy with this piece of content actually has the potential of impact. And that's what we sent over, is we sent these tickets, and we will have our statistics, right? But I think we were pretty effective in getting them to act on things that they hadn't acted on before, because we specifically mapped to their policies and we told them how it was violating those policies. For people outside the United States, these policies, there's actually some pretty good policies now. What you should be asking for is for them to be enforced in your country, because this is something we haven't talked about that I think we'll talk about in our final report. Is if you look at these policies, like the advertising policies and such, for most of these companies, it's only the US or it's only the US and Europe. This has to become a global standard that gets rolled out everywhere. And so that's where I would focus my activism if I was outside the US, is on getting the same kind of enforcement of what we saw here.
I can take on a different part of the question here, and that is about sustainability. Going back to some early work that I was doing as a PhD student in the area of crowdsourcing and crisis events. And there's some really interesting overlaps there. There was a lot of attention. I don't know if you all remember the Haiti earthquake and some other big events that happened in the world. A lot of efforts for people to converge, collaborations like this, and efforts to bring to bear all these different kinds of skill sets to contribute to addressing a problem. What happened over time to those communities is that they got exhausted because eventually they took on too many things, and and you begin to get to the long tail, and it's easy for people to respond to a very high profile crisis, but there's crises all over the world all the time. And I think election disinformation is going to be really similar. We do have, groups of people that are gaining skills, that are interested, that are willing to apply their efforts towards these problems. But as we begin to think about the long tail and all the places where this work needs to be done, there is a sustainability issue. There's a sustainability issue both over time for individuals, and also, like, how do you scale out and scale up and address places that really need it, but that aren't necessarily where the people that have the skills are going to pay attention because they're busy doing something else, right? So there's some really interesting things about how do we transfer knowledge and make sure that we can empower new groups of people to be able to do this, because one core group is not going to be able to sustain itself over time. And so it's something for us to look out for, not us in this partnership, but as a larger community of people who care about these problems, is how do we enable more people to participate and have that sort of sustainability of energy and resources over time and across contexts.
Yeah, I really agree with everything my colleagues just said. I'll just add another sort of cherry on that cake. I think there's a lot of work for us to do on transparency on these questions, where the EIP also presents a really interesting model is as Alex said, we have a record for each of these incidents that we worked on, and we have the company's replies, right? Like, this is what we're seeing. This is why we think it shouldn't be on your platform. And here is the action that you've taken. That creates a very unique data set of incidents that have to do with disinformation on which action was taken. And that has been an area on which there's been extraordinarily little transparency, with an exception for everything having to do with foreign interference and information, which is almost like the odd little bubble where we have a little bit more transparency. What we've learned in a very clear way since 2016 is more transparency on these issues does increase security and does increase platform accountability. And so continuing to find ways to push for more transparency. And again, we're not acknowledging that they aren't important privacy questions to be worked through, but now we have models and we have best practices to follow and advocate for on the transparency side of disinformation enforcement too.
Hey, before we leave, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to all of our colleagues who worked on this. So you're seeing 5 of us right now, but again, there's like 120 people who worked on this. And so on my team, I'm specifically going to shout out Isabella Garcia Camargo, who was the intern who went to CISA and had kind of the first idea around this, and Elena Christ, who really helped this operationally come together. I don't know if anybody else wants to give any shout outs, but I want to make sure all the people in the audience understand that there's huge teams behind each of us.
Gigantic teams. I'll give a specific shout out to Melanie Smith on our end, who really corralled our analysts and researchers in participating to this project and did a fantastic job. I know you will also have shout outs to give.
Yeah, our side, so many different people I'd like to thank, but one of them that doesn't get a lot of thanks is Michael Grass, who was actually our communication specialist, who we devoted a good chunk of his time over to this, and he did a great job at pulling together press conferences and other things, and then just all of our analysts. I can't even go in to name them all because it would take too long, but it's been great. And then my colleagues at the Center for an Informed Public that empowered me to do this, said go for it, and gave me the space to do it, and supported me as well, Jevin West and Emma Spiro, and they are co-authors on some of the things we wrote as well. So it's been fantastic to be part of this team and our UW team as well. It's been just a great experience.
Yeah, incredibly important point. One shout out going up on my end, and then one shout out going across our team. As you all know, if you're tuned into this conversation, you're typically not hearing about domestic policy analysis in the United States from the Atlantic Council. And so a huge shout out to the organization for understanding that many of the challenges that we face in the world don't respect our neatly defined borders. And there isn't one as catalytic or the one that like makes everything else uniquely worse as disinformation. If disinformation is applied to a big other challenges like climate change or like great power competition or anything like that, then it makes that challenge worse. And so the Atlantic Council making an investment in looking at this, regardless of the borders that we're looking at, that's been an incredibly, gratifying process to go through at the Atlantic Council, but also specifically at the DFR Lab. I have to shout out to Emerson Brooking, who has led a lot of this work and research on behalf of the DFR Lab, as well as the rest of our research team, as always, located around the world and kind of surging on unique aspects of like weird things that we're seeing in the information environment. But none of that surge capacity would have worked if not for the coordination and leadership of Emerson. So thank you to Emerson, and thank you to all the colleagues on this call. You hear from us quite a bit. Alex's point on there's a big backbone and a long tail of this entire effort that you're not seeing right now. That will continue to be the case going forward, but incredible partnership and lovely to work with everybody. I think that the last question on whether this is sustainable, the organization itself is likely not sustainable realistically, but the collaboration across the community certainly is, and is certainly something that I would hope that we're all committed to. So thank you to Emerson. And thank you.
At a minimum, with the election over, I think we have to change the logo, right?
Yeah.
And I just want to point out, Graham is clearly the one of us that lives in DC and that he remembered to thank his bosses. That was, I've much to learn from you still, Sensei.
All right, all. Well, look, it's been an absolute honor to host Camille, Alex, and Kate today. It's been an honor to be part of the Election Integrity Partnership. I wish we could have reached every question, but it's been great to have such good attendance here. If you want to learn more about the work of the partnership, go to eipartnership.net or follow us on Twitter at 2020 Partnership. Also, be on the lookout for our big report, which should be out early next year. You'll be able to find it a number of places, but we'll also try to distribute it to folks on this event. So thanks again for joining us today, and take care, everybody.